So I'll now turn to the last case study. We have about 25 or so minutes, so we have plenty of time still. And I've asked Richard if he could take the lead on this particular case study, which is a fairly sort of straightforward case study with regard to a checkpoint scenario and questions of escalation of force. And we are again in the context of a non-international armed conflict. Richard, the mic is yours.
Thank you, Jamie. In this one, in the context of a non-international armed conflict, a suspicious car arrives at a checkpoint manned by the belligerent state's armed forces. Although the checkpoint is clearly indicated, the car arrives at high speed and does not stop when ordered to do so. I would say, first of all, just as you know, this case study, very realistic, happens quite frequently. We've seen it happen in Afghanistan. We've seen it happen in Iraq. I'm sure it's happened in other conflict settings as well. You know, and obviously the case study, you know, one of the first things that it's clear is that it's manned. The checkpoint is manned by armed forces, not manned by police forces or local security forces, although those occur as well. And so you may have in many areas, you may have a checkpoint manned by, you may have two checkpoints co-located or near each other, one manned by the armed forces, one manned by the police forces, for example. And what we've seen is another game changer, if you'll excuse the phrase, on checkpoints, has been the introduction of suicide vehicle-borne explosive devices, or SVBEIEDs, and that has been one of the biggest changes really since 9/11 that we've seen, at least in the theaters of Afghanistan and Iraq, whereas before IEDs, a speeding vehicle might just have been a speeding vehicle that would crash through the checkpoint or go around the checkpoint and would certainly be considered to be less of a threat, whereas nowadays I think anyone, certainly soldiers manning checkpoints, assume that a vehicle that does not respond to warnings, that is driving at a high rate of speed, is probably loaded with explosives. Now that may not be the case, but that's certainly what the soldiers at the checkpoint tend to think, because you know, they've seen that happen throughout the theater of armed conflict. So it changes their mindsets. So we looked at really a couple of questions here with this scenario. Would the use of force by soldiers operating the checkpoint be governed by the conduct of hostilities or the law enforcement paradigm? How should the situation be addressed in case of doubt as to the status, function, or conduct of the person suspected to be a threat? As the experts at the meeting looked at this, the one thing that became apparent is, much like the riot control setting that we just addressed, that state practice tends to show that most people have procedures and rules of engagement in place which provide for, you know, the term of art now is escalation of force measures or techniques. And those are pretty used widely, for example, in Afghanistan, throughout all the NATO forces. I'm sure it's used in other places as well. So procedures that, although they look like law enforcement, don't necessarily mean that states are saying that they're in a law enforcement paradigm. They're just using techniques that police at an adjacent checkpoint might use as well. And so those techniques would include measures to warn, for example, lights or signs or things like that. You have measures to slow vehicles down. That might include a, you know, kind of a serpentine barriers that force a car to go back and forth and slow it down, or you might have speed bumps or other measures. And so you'll have a number of these types of escalation of force. First of all, warning measures, signs, sounds, physical barriers, and then you'll have escalation of force procedures behind that if vehicles continue to approach the checkpoint at a high rate of speed. And those could include warning shots. They could include flashing laser lights at the driver. They could other types of warnings, up to and including deadly force if the vehicle continues not to respond. Many of the experts talking through this kind of came to the conclusion that that ultimately, if we're in a conduct of hostilities paradigm, then lethal force is used because the individuals manning the checkpoint believe that the individual driving the car is a legitimate target. That they first consider that the individual civilian, they take precautions, and when the vehicle continues to go forward, that they can consider that to be a legitimate target. Folks using the law enforcement paradigm use kind of the idea that the person constitutes an imminent threat to life, and therefore lethal force would be used. And then kind of the third method of analysis used in the vehicle checkpoint setting was just that this is the right to self-defense, and that the individual, irrespective of which paradigm you think you're in, uses lethal force in self-defense. You know, it seemed like, at least my perspective, and I'll be interested to hear the other panelists, but from what I could tell at the expert meeting, this is one of the areas where, irrespective of which paradigm you use, most people came to the same conclusion, that in a country where there's a very real threat of suicide vehicle-borne IED devices, that a vehicle speeding, ignoring precautions, ignoring warnings, ignoring escalation of force procedures, a vehicle speeding towards your checkpoint, then you could use lawful or lethal force to engage that. One of the questions that the experts were unable to determine is where is the legal requirement for these escalation force procedures, if there is one. I mean, certainly I think most people felt like universally folks felt like it was good policy to have these escalation of force procedures in place. But the real question was, what requires it under law? And there wasn't a consensus with that. Some people thought it was required as a principle of military necessity, as well as a principle of distinction, that by putting in place these procedures that enabled you in a law of armed conflict setting to determine whether or not the person was a legitimate target, if that was the paradigm that you were using. On the other hand, if you were those that were under the law enforcement paradigm thought that that escalation of force procedures might derive from those law enforcement principles, the need to determine whether or not the necessity to take life was there. But there was no consensus on what it was. Now, a few experts at the meeting questioned whether the function or purpose of the checkpoint would actually determine which paradigm you were under and what law applied. There didn't seem to be consensus on that point either. You know, I would just say from my own experience, a checkpoint run by the military is done for military purposes. It's not done to enforce domestic law. It's not done to, you know, for law enforcement purposes at all. It's typically, if the military is running a checkpoint, it's being done to find enemy fighters moving back and forth among the population, to find shipments of weapons, to find explosive devices, etc. And so it's done, it's done for military purposes as part of a military operation. It's not a law enforcement function. Whereas the police running a checkpoint in the same area might be doing it for law enforcement purposes, to enforce domestic law, etc. As you know, Gloria pointed out in the last case study, do the factors of control over the area and intensity of violence, do they matter in this case? And certainly I think while they matter, I don't think most folks thought they were decisive, because regardless of how much control you have over the area, regardless of the intensity of violence in the area, if there's a history or if there's a pattern of the use of explosive devices in cars, suicide bombers, and you're the soldier at the checkpoint with the car speeding towards you, then typically you're going to respond to that, irrespective of the other factors that would come into play. Jamie, I think I'll stop there and open it up for other panelists and any questions we might have gotten from the audience.
Thanks, Rich, for again a sort of rich number of issues that were put forward to us. I think the question of the legal nature or the nature of the threat will of course have bearing on the question of the imminence of the threat, depending on the context, and the legal requirements in terms of the escalation of force was interesting as well. from the expert meeting. And we have had a couple of questions come in as well from attendees with regard to, you mentioned the police and we mentioned the military, but there's also a third set of actors that seem to have appeared in some of these contexts, private military security contractors. What rules govern their actions in those particular situations? So we have about 15 or so minutes left, so I'll turn the floor over to David to respond to anything that Rich may have said.
Well, fundamentally, I agree with Rich. If I take the most demanding situation, and I assume for the moment that even we're talking about a law enforcement paradigm, it seems to me that it would be totally reasonable for soldiers in this situation to see that such a car presents an imminent threat to their life, and in such a situation, even that under this paradigm, they could use force and possibly lethal force in order to contain the risk. So if that is the situation, then it seems to me that it is quite clear that given the context, as we are talking of an armed conflict, and the fact that are laid down in our hypothetical now, which is sometimes not hypothetical, I fundamentally agree with the analysis of Richard, and I don't think I have much to add.
Thanks very much, David, and good to see we have agreement on a couple of points. So I'll ask Gloria if she's anything to add to what both Richard and Dave have mentioned.
Thank you, Jamie. Yeah, in this checkpoint scenario, I think we need to distinguish two different sub-situations. The first situation is where you have no doubts. So the soldier at a certain point is very certain that the person in the car is a fighter. In that case, for the expert during the expert meetings, it was clear that the person could be targeted. Instead, if the person in the car is clearly a civilian who did not understand that this is a checkpoint, that the person has to stop, then it would be the law enforcement paradigm. When it becomes interesting with this checkpoint scenario is in the sub-situation where you have a doubt. So here you don't know whether the person is in the car arriving at high speed is indeed an insurgent, a fighter, or maybe is just a civilian. So you don't know. And it was indeed a great outcome that the experts agreed that in practice you will need to do an escalation of force procedure. So it's the same result in practice. However, they came to these results adopting different legal analysis. Everything started with the rule regarding the doubt under IHL, because in case of doubt, there is a rule saying that you presume that the person is a civilian. So starting from there, some of the experts said, well, if the person is presumed to be a civilian, then you cannot use force against that person unless through the law enforcement paradigm in order to maintain or restore public security, law and order, meaning that the use of force would be the last resort and lethal force would be the very last resort. Others said, well, in case of doubt, you need to do everything feasible under the principle of precautions under IHL in order to verify whether the person is a military objective or is instead protected from attack. So it was through this notion of verifying whether the person is a military objective or not, through the principle of precautions, that the escalation of force procedure was taken into account. So it was more than a policy that was submitted, but it was submitted that it is a requirement that derives from the principle of precautions. So this was quite interesting, and it is positive in the sense that it means that even under IHL, in certain circumstances, you need to do an escalation of force procedure. I would just say that we need to be careful so that belligerents should not believe that the obligation to verify under the principle of precaution allows to use a certain amount of force against civilians. So in a sense, it would mean that the escalation of force, it would be only the first steps that you could use until, as long as you have a doubt. So you could use lights, maybe even warning shots, but disabling shots would not be allowed if you still have a doubt whether a person is a civilian or not. when you have no doubt anymore, then it's another story. Then you can target and kill. Now I have two questions, and I will end with a comment. So my first question, because I went through the reports and the discussions again and again, and we were all satisfied during the expert meeting that an escalation of force was required, whether under the law enforcement or conduct of hostilities. But my question is, for the other panelists, is does it really lead to the exact same results under the conduct of hostilities and under the law enforcement paradigm? Of course, we could say it's the same type of procedure. So you do warning, you show force, then you do less than lethal force, and maybe lethal force at the very end. So it's the same type of procedure. But is it really the same? Because if I take the IHL perspective and the conduct of hostilities perspective, the trigger then for the use of force is whether or not you have a doubt. When you have no doubt anymore, then you might attack. Under law enforcement, it's not the case. Even if you're convinced that in front of you you have a criminal, then you still need to use the minimum amount of force possible. So that's my question. Is it exactly the same or is it different? My second question is, in that case, do we really need to choose between the conduct of hostilities and law enforcement? Because maybe both apply depending on the situations. For instance, if we think about the soldier, if the soldier does not know who is the person in the car, but the car is running into the soldier, I think everyone would agree that the soldier has a right to defend his own life and to react in self-defense independently on who is in the car. So that would be a first possibility. Another possibility that might apply at the same time is that the soldier, on the basis of an analysis of several circumstances and of concrete and objectively verifiable facts, at a certain point reaches the conviction that the person is a fighter. So of course this will depend on many things. First, the number of incidents the previous days. Rich mentioned the fact that in some circumstances there are suicide attacks that are frequent. So obviously if you are in such a context, you might reach this conclusion that the person is a legitimate target quicker, faster. Then where the checkpoint is probably will also have an influence. So you will need to look at different factual circumstances in order to do your assessment. But if you have no doubt anymore, then you might target. So probably there are situations where you could have both on a checkpoint scenario. And finally, I will end with a remark that the circumstances in the checkpoint scenario are key, whether you are under conduct of hostilities paradigm or law enforcement paradigm. So all the factual circumstances and probably also the notion of intensity of violence, of control, of conflict zone, the frequency of suicide attacks, the modus operandi of those doing the suicide attacks will have an impact on the way you apply the escalation of force. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gloria, and some valid questions here. So we have about 5 or 6 minutes left, but certainly I think the question there, the questions that Gloria raised with regard to the applicable paradigm and whether or not we need to look at that when we're looking at the results were quite valid. And I think the question, the point I took from what Gloria mentioned here was a question of disabling shots, that they're not allowed if there's an element of doubt still. And I'd be interested to see how you respond to that. So about 5 minutes left. I'll give the floor to Juan Carlos quickly, and then to Richard, who also wants to address a couple of points, and also maybe speak about the prior security contractors before we wrap up this webinar.
Okay, I want to make a point in this part. And first of all, I think that rule of engagement are key here. And also, you have to see case by case. In the Colombian case, for instance, here is not common to see suicide cars as you can see them in Asia. So I remember here that something that happened years ago in checkpoints we had 2 or 3 mistakes by the soldiers and they kill civilians. And the decision at that time by the general commander was to avoid shooting in checkpoints. So he said, I remember pretty well, he said, I prefer, if in that car were a member of the guerrilla, let him go. Maybe we can catch him tomorrow or after tomorrow, but we don't want to have any other mistake. And that happened at that time here, but because we didn't have the problem of suicides car. I think that today is different. Today, in the rule of engagement, the commander, taking into account the real situation of the region in where he is working, he can make the decision to allow the soldiers to react, to shoot, but also he has to take into account the responsibility of making that decision to allow the soldiers to shoot.
Thank you, Juan Carlos, and I think you sort of highlighted a fairly important point there with regard to, I think, the initial comments made by Rich as well, with regard to the level of threat and the nature of the threat that, of course, the soldiers are facing or the law enforcement officials are facing in this particular context. That if we have a question of suicide bombers, then, of course, the rules of engagement and the escalation of force might be somewhat different if the threat is usually, in other situations, simply a car being driven at the checkpoint. But Rich, I know you had a couple of points you wanted to make here, and maybe also address, if possible, the private contractors component.
Yeah, thank you, Jamie. The first thing I would say, and just really highlight this for everybody, is when we write these rules of engagement, when we tell our soldiers what to do, remember that they literally have less time than the time it's taken me to finish this sentence to make life and death decisions. That there's a car speeding at them very quickly. They're scared for their lives. They've seen their friends die. They've seen suicide bombers all over the country in the case of the theaters I'm familiar with, and they have no time to decide whether or not to live or die. And so our rules of engagement have to be clear. Our escalation of force procedures have to be clear, and we have to do everything possible to put advance warnings that can be understood by the local population, to put in the barriers and the warning devices to try to prevent that situation. But I'm always going to go back to, that soldier who sits on that checkpoint who just does not have a lot of time to make a life or death decision. So that's critical when we think through these issues. Keep them in mind. On disabling shots, we in Afghanistan, the NATO ISAF Joint Command commander outlawed those or forbid them, prohibited them, because so many of the disabling shots were ricocheting into the car and hitting civilians. So those, for policy reasons, are probably a bad idea, and we certainly saw them as such in Afghanistan. And then on private security companies, those, for policy reasons, it's probably best to have them on stationary checkpoints guarding facilities and not out in playing a role that really is better suited to either the armed forces of the country or the police forces of a country. I think you use private security guards primarily at a static checkpoint at the entrance to bases, and then they're going to have essentially rules for use of force to protect themselves against imminent threat. Jamie, I'll stop there because I think we're out of time.
Thanks, Rich. We are just about out of time, but IT have told me that we will not lose a connection at 3 o'clock on the dot, so we have a few more minutes to have David's couple of comments to this case study, and then I'll give the floor to each and every one of you for any concluding remarks you have before we wrap things up. So, David, over to you.
Thank you. Now, Rich has said what I wanted to say, and it's so important to understand. We're talking about a non-international armed conflict. We don't have a clear distinction of who is a fighter, who is a potential suicide bomber, and who is not. And the soldiers are in the position that they have to make a split-second decision. And when they have a very, very reasonable fear that their lives are in danger, it's impossible to make rules which will avoid them from using the force needed to protect themselves. That's all I have to say.